The strange part was that Paige didn't call me after work. She called while I was shoulder deep in a walk-in freezer behind a seafood place on King Street, sweat running down my back, trying to figure out why the compressor kept cutting out every 20 minutes. My phone buzzed inside my tool bag. I almost ignored it, but I saw the name on the screen. Paige. For a second, I just stared at it. I hadn't talked to Paige much since Brooke and I split up. There was no big reason not to. Nobody had been cruel. Nobody had thrown plates or made scenes in parking lots. Brooke and I just got quieter around each other until one day she said she wanted a life that felt bigger than ours. That was 2 years earlier. I wiped my hand on a rag and answered. "Hey, Paige." Her pause was small, but I heard it. "Hi, Miles. Is this a bad time?" "I'm standing in a freezer that's trying to become a sauna, so it's about average." She laughed once. Softly. Paige had always laughed like she was checking whether she was allowed to. "I'm sorry. I can call later." "No. What's going on?" She took a breath. "I got the job." "What job?" "At the St. Clair Hotel. Event coordinator. I interviewed a few weeks ago." I leaned against the steel door, looking out at the bright alley behind the restaurant. "That's in Charleston." "Yeah. That's good, Paige." "It is, I think." Her voice lifted at the end like she wasn't convinced. "I have to be there in 10 days." I waited for the rest. "I'm moving from Savannah," she said, "and I don't really know anyone in Charleston." That was the point where I should have said I was busy. My Saturdays filled up fast enough with service calls, boat repairs, grocery shopping, and pretending I enjoyed having nothing on the calendar. Instead, I said, "What do you need?" "I hate asking you." "You called me." "I know." Another pause. "I need help moving. I rented a truck, but I have a few things I can't handle alone. Bookshelves, a table, some boxes." "You own a lot of books. I remember that." "You remember that? Your family had Christmas at your parents' place every year. You always disappeared into the den with a paperback before dessert." She was quiet long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "So you'll help?" I looked through the open back door at the restaurant manager pacing around with both hands in his hair. The freezer was still warm. My workday was not getting easier. "Send me the address," I said. "I'll be there Saturday." Saturday came hot and clear. I left Charleston before sunrise in my old truck, coffee in the cup holder and a moving blanket folded behind the seats. Savannah was only a couple hours away, but it felt farther when you were driving towards somebody connected to a life you had already packed up and put away. Paige's apartment was on the second floor of a narrow building near a row of small shops. When she opened the door, she looked different from the version I remembered at family dinners. Not different in some dramatic way, just more grown into herself. She wore a pale blue sundress and flat sandals, her hair pinned up badly, like she'd been fighting with it all morning. There was a smudge of dust on one cheek. "You came," she said. "I said I would." "I know. Still." Her apartment was neat, but the living room looked like a bookstore had lost a fight with a garden shop. Boxes marked books covered one wall. There were flower vases wrapped in towels, framed postcards stacked beside the door, and 3 plants sitting in the bathtub because apparently that was where she decided they would survive the trip. I looked around. "You sure this is all yours?" "Mostly." "Mostly?" "The plants are definitely mine. The table belonged to my grandmother." I pointed at the boxes. "And those?" "My bad decisions." I laughed. "Books aren't bad decisions. They are when you have to carry them downstairs." She was right. By the third box, my arms felt like I'd spent the morning lifting concrete blocks. Paige kept trying to take the heavier things, and I kept moving them out of her hands. "You know I can carry a box," she said. "I know. I'm just trying to avoid hearing Brooke's family say I made you do all the work." Her face changed slightly at Brooke's name. Not angry, just careful. "I don't really talk to her much anymore," she said. I looked at her. You two okay? We're sisters. That's not the same as being okay. I didn't ask more. It didn't feel like my place. The drive back to Charleston was easier than I expected. Paige sat beside me with one knee tucked under her, holding a coffee she barely touched. We talked about the hotel job, weddings with impossible schedules, rich clients who wanted historic charm, but also complained when old buildings had old building problems. You'll be good at it, I told her. You don't know that. I know you once fixed a seating chart during a family reunion because Aunt Diane refused to sit near Uncle Mark. That was not an event. That was a public service. I smiled, and she looked out the window. Her new apartment was above a bakery downtown, 3rd floor, bright windows, old wood floors, and a narrow balcony that looked down over a street full of people walking with shopping bags and iced drinks. The whole place smelled like warm bread and sugar. By late afternoon, we had most of her things inside. The last big piece was the small wooden table from her grandmother. It wasn't heavy, but it was awkward, with one loose leg and a drawer that kept sliding open. Turn it this way, I said. I am turning it. You're turning it toward the wall. The wall is very involved in this move. I tried not to laugh, but I did anyway. We got it through the living room doorway, both of us holding one end. Paige stopped suddenly. I almost dropped my side. What? She was looking at me. Not past me, not down at the table, right at me. The apartment was quiet except for the bakery noise drifting up from the street. Her face had gone still. Then she said, barely above a whisper, "You should have been mine." I honestly thought I heard her wrong. What did you say? Her eyes widened. She let go of the table with one hand, then grabbed it again. Nothing. I didn't say anything. Paige. I meant the table, she said quickly. I meant you should have been mine, like you should have been the one helping me move it earlier. That didn't make sense either. Forget it. I stood there holding one end of that table, staring at her while she stared at the floor. Then I said the only thing I could think of. Okay. It was a useless word, a cowardly word, but it was all I had. We set the table down by the window. Paige thanked me 3 times while I carried in the last boxes. She offered me dinner. I said I had to get home. That wasn't exactly true. I just didn't trust myself to sit across from her and act like nothing had happened. When I left, the sun was low over the street, turning the brick buildings gold. Paige stood in the apartment doorway with one hand on the frame. "Thanks, Miles," she said. I nodded. Then I walked down the stairs, got in my truck, and drove home with one sentence stuck in my head the whole way. You should have been mine. For the next week, I told myself I was staying away from Paige's apartment because I was busy. That part wasn't completely false. Early summer was rough on refrigeration work. Restaurant kitchens ran hot, grocery cases worked overtime, and every old building downtown seemed to have an air system held together by dust and bad decisions. But I also knew I could have made time if I wanted to. I just didn't know what I was supposed to do with what she'd said. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, my phone lit up with her name. Paige. My ceiling fan is making a sound like it's trying to leave the apartment. I stared at the message. Me. That sounds expensive. Paige. I have pastries from downstairs. That was how I ended up standing on a chair in her living room 40 minutes later, taking the fan cover off while Paige held a screwdriver she clearly had no intention of using. You don't have to stand there, I said. I'm supervising. You're eating a cinnamon roll. I can do both. The place looked more settled than it had on moving day. Her books were lined up in the shelf I'd helped assemble. Flowers sat in a blue glass vase by the window. A few framed postcards had made it onto the walls. The little wooden table was near the balcony door, still slightly uneven. I tightened the fan bracket and turned it back on. It spun quietly. Paige clapped once. You fixed it. It was loose. You say that like it's nothing. It was nothing. She handed me a paper bag from the bakery. Then accept your payment. Inside was a warm pastry with sugar on top. I took a bite before I could stop myself. Good? She asked. Annoyingly good. Write in the comments, what's your favorite thing to get from a bakery? Cinnamon rolls, croissants, donuts, or something else? I knew you'd like that one. I looked at her. You knew? You like coffee black. You don't like things too sweet. So I figured you'd prefer the almond one. I lowered the bag. How do you know I drink coffee black? Her expression changed for half a second. Not fear exactly. More like she'd said too much without meaning to. Family holidays, she said. You always made your own coffee after breakfast. That was years ago. I remember things. She said it simply, then walked toward the balcony like the conversation was over. I followed her out with the pastry in my hand. The evening was warm, the kind that made the whole city smell like baked bread, sunscreen, and old brick. Below us, people moved along the sidewalk with shopping bags and iced drinks. Somewhere farther down the street, somebody was playing music badly, but confidently. Paige had made sweet tea in a glass pitcher. She poured me some without asking. You don't put lemon in yours, she said. I looked at the glass, then at her. She gave a small shrug. What? Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. That was the problem. A few days later, she called because the latch on her balcony door wouldn't close. Then, a delivery came while she was at the hotel, and she asked if I could bring the boxes upstairs. After that, the little table started wobbling worse, so I fixed the loose leg while she stood nearby and pretended not to watch me work. She was easy to be around in a way that made me nervous. Brooke had always filled silence. She'd turn on music, call somebody, make plans for the weekend, ask why I was being quiet when I was just sitting there. Paige didn't do that. With her, quiet wasn't a problem that needed fixing. One Friday night, she called after 9. I know it's late, she said, but I had a wedding reception run over by 2 hours, and one of the groomsmen threw up near the gift table. I leaned against my kitchen counter. That sounds like a strong finish. I've been eating crackers from the hotel break room since noon. Have you eaten anything else? No. I looked in my fridge. Then I grabbed my keys. 20 minutes later, I was outside her building with takeout from a seafood place near my house. Nothing fancy. Shrimp, rice, fries, and 2 cups of coleslaw. She opened the apartment door wearing a fitted black work dress and sandals, with her hair falling out of whatever style she'd started the day with. She looked tired enough that she didn't even pretend to be surprised. You brought food, she said. You said crackers. I was complaining. That's different. Eat anyway. We sat at the small table while she told me about the wedding. The bride had wanted candles everywhere. The hotel had rules about candles. The bride had argued with 3 people, cried twice, then hugged Paige at the end and said she was a lifesaver. You create perfect nights for strangers, I said. Paige picked at her rice. That's the job. And then you come home alone. She looked up. I hadn't meant to say it like that. After a moment, she said, Yeah, sometimes that part feels strange. I nodded. I get it. She smiled, but it didn't reach all the way to her eyes. A week later, I met her near the city market on a Saturday morning. She said she needed flowers for an event mock-up and wanted somebody to carry them. I told her that was a very polite way to ask for labor. She wore a cotton dress and had sunglasses pushed into her hair. Every few minutes, somebody walking past would turn their head to look at her, and I hated that I noticed. We wandered between the vendors, looking at woven baskets, paintings, handmade candles, and things I couldn't identify but assumed were expensive. Paige bought a small bunch of white flowers and a jar of peach preserves from an older woman who knew her by name after one conversation. At one stall, Paige picked up a leather keychain. Mine was clipped to my work keys, plain black rubber with a faded company logo. Hers hung from the strap of her bag. Worn brown leather. 2 stamped initials. MC. I saw them clearly when she reached for her wallet. "That your old boyfriend?" I asked before I could think better of it. She froze. Then she curled her hand around the keychain. "No," she said. I waited. She looked away toward the market crowd. "It's just something old." The answer should have been enough. It wasn't. We walked down toward the water afterward. Boats moved slowly in the distance, and the heat bounced off the sidewalk hard enough to make my shirt stick to my back. Paige was quiet beside me. Finally, she said, "Miles, about what I said when you moved me in." My chest tightened. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen, and whatever she had been about to say disappeared from her face. "Sorry," she said. "Hotel." She answered before I could tell her not to. That night, after I got home, Brooke called. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I saw her name and answered anyway. "Miles," she said. "Hey." "I heard Paige moved to Charleston." I sat down on the edge of my couch. "News travels." "She asked you to help her?" There was something in her voice I recognized. Not anger exactly. Something sharper. "Yeah," I said. "She needed help." Brooke was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Just be careful with Paige. She's always had a problem with boundaries." And suddenly, the little leather keychain on Paige's bag didn't feel so harmless anymore. After Brooke's call, I did something I wasn't proud of. I got careful. Not in a smart way. In the kind of way where you don't ask a question because you're afraid the answer might change something you've started to enjoy. Paige texted me the next evening. "Paige, are you still coming by to look at the shelves?" I stared at the message longer than I needed to. Me. "Yeah, I'll be there after work." Her apartment was warm when I got there. Windows open, fan turning quietly above us. She had a stack of floating shelves on the floor and a level sitting beside them like she'd been preparing for a real contractor. "You bought the fancy one," I said. "It was on sale. It has a laser. I wanted to feel capable." "You could have bought a hammer and felt capable for less money." She smiled, but it faded fast. Normally she would have handed me sweet tea or told me something that happened at the hotel. This time she stayed quiet while I measured the wall. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah. You've said maybe 6 words since you got here. I'm working. You talk while you work." I kept my eyes on the level. "Depends what I'm working on." That landed harder than I meant it to. Paige crossed her arms, then looked toward the balcony. "Did Brooke call you?" I stopped. The room went still. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you look at me like I broke something and you're deciding whether it can be fixed." I set the drill down. "She said you have issues with boundaries." Paige's face went pale, then closed up. "She said that? Did she lie?" Paige didn't answer right away. That was enough to make my stomach tighten. "I'm going to leave," I said. "Miles, I should probably get going." I left the shelves half installed. I told myself I was giving both of us room to think. The truth was, I didn't want to stand there and hear something that made the last few weeks feel stupid. For the next several days, I kept my distance. Paige didn't chase me. That made it worse. She sent one message about the shelves. Then nothing. A week later, I was back in her apartment anyway. I had agreed to finish installing them because I hated leaving a job halfway done. That was the reason I gave myself. Not a good one, but it got me through the door. I was standing on a chair with a drill in my hand when someone knocked. Paige looked toward the door. "I'm not expecting anyone," she said. Neither was I. She opened it, and Brooke stepped inside. Wearing sunglasses, a white blouse, and the expression of somebody who had been rehearsing a conversation in the car. For a second, nobody moved. Then Brooke looked at me. "So it's true," she said. Paige shut the door slowly. "Why are you here?" "I'm in town with friends." That doesn't answer the question. Brooke ignored her and looked around the room. Her eyes landed on the shelves, then on me, holding the drill. "You really did make yourself comfortable," she said. I climbed down from the chair. "Brooke, don't start." She gave a short laugh. "You think I started this?" Paige's voice stayed low. "Please don't do this here." "Why not?" Brooke said. "He deserves to know why you moved to Charleston." My grip tightened around the drill. Paige looked at the floor. Brooke stepped closer to me. "She liked you before I did, before I even started dating you. She had this little crush and acted like it wasn't there, but I saw it." "Brooke," Paige said. "No, you don't get to act innocent now. You chose Charleston because he lives here. You called him because you knew he'd help. You've been waiting for an opening since the day we got married." Paige looked at me then, not pleading, not trying to win me over, just tired. "It's true," she said. The room felt smaller. Brooke folded her arms. "There. Now you know." Paige walked over to the table and picked up her bag. The worn leather keychain hung from the strap. She unhooked it carefully and held it in her palm. "I noticed Miles first," she said. "That's true too." Brooke looked away. Paige kept talking, but only to me. "I met you at that cookout at my parents' house. You fixed the porch chair because my dad said he'd get to it later, and you didn't make a big deal out of it. You just saw it was broken and fixed it." I remembered the chair. I barely remembered doing it. "You and Brooke started dating a few weeks after that," Paige said, "and once that happened, I stayed out of it. I never told you. I never hinted. I never tried to make her doubt you." Brooke's jaw tightened. Paige held up the keychain. "I made this after Christmas that year. I found a piece of leather at a market, stamped your initials into it, and kept it. That was it. It was private. It was mine to carry, not yours to deal with." I looked at the initials. MC. The whole time, I had assumed it belonged to somebody else. "I didn't move here just because of you," Paige said. "The St. Clair job is real. I wanted it. I worked for it. But I also knew you were here." She swallowed. "And after 2 years, I thought maybe I could ask for help without pretending you meant nothing to me." Brooke let out a breath through her nose. "You hear how that sounds?" I turned toward her. "Yeah," I said. "I do." She looked surprised. I set the drill on the counter. "Paige having feelings she never acted on isn't some crime," I said. "You left me, Brooke. You said you wanted more than this life. That was your choice." Her face changed. "I'm not saying you were wrong," I continued. "But don't come in here acting like you're protecting me. You're trying to make sure the story stays the same. That I was the boring husband you outgrew, and nothing else happened after you left." Brooke looked at me for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Maybe I didn't know what I wanted." "Maybe," I said. She nodded once, almost to herself. Then she picked up her bag. "I hope this doesn't blow up in your face," she said to Paige. Paige didn't answer. Brooke left without slamming the door. After she was gone, Paige stood by the table with the keychain still in her hand. I looked at the half-finished shelves, the open windows, the sunlight across the floor. Then I looked at her. And for the first time, I understood that the thing between us had been there long before either of us had said it out loud. For 3 days after Brooke left, I didn't call Paige. I kept telling myself I was thinking things through. Really, I was sitting in my truck between service calls, looking at my phone and wondering why doing the right thing always felt harder once real people were involved. At night, I worked on the boat behind my house. The motor still needed attention, and the trailer lights had stopped working again. I could handle that. A bad wire had a cause. You found it, replaced it, and moved on. People weren't built that way. Brooke had wanted me louder, more social, more willing to spend Friday nights in crowded places with people I barely knew. For a long time, I thought that meant there was something wrong with being the guy who came home, grilled fish, fixed the porch step, and liked a quiet Saturday morning. Then, Paige had stood in front of me with that old keychain in her hand and made me realize she had noticed all of it. Not some better version of me. Me. On Monday morning, before I left for work, I sent her one message. Me. Coffee before work tomorrow? She replied less than a minute later. Paige. Yes. We met at a small place near the hotel. Paige was already outside when I pulled up, wearing a simple cream-colored dress and holding 2 coffees. Mine was black. Of course it was. She handed it to me without smiling too much. Thanks, I said. You're welcome. For a minute, we just stood there beside my truck while traffic moved down the street. Finally, I said, I don't want to punish you for something you never did. Paige looked down at her cup. I know. But I also don't want this to become some secret thing. Or something we do because Brooke made it complicated. She nodded slowly. I don't want that either. I don't want to be somebody you built up in your mind for years. That got her to look at me. You're not, she said. You leave tools everywhere. You forget to eat when you're working. You get quiet when you're upset and expect everyone else to understand what that means. That sounds flattering. It's honest. I almost laughed. Then she stepped closer, not touching me, just close enough that I could smell her perfume over the coffee. I liked you before, she said, but I don't want some old idea of you. I want to know who you are now. That was about as direct as Paige ever got. So I nodded. Slow, I said. Slow, she agreed. It started there, not with a huge moment, not with promises neither of us knew how to keep, just coffee before work. Then it became dinners after long days, walks through old streets when the sun was going down, Paige telling me about hotel clients who wanted impossible things, me telling her which restaurant coolers were one bad week away from giving up completely. She came to my house one Sunday and stood in the backyard looking at my boat under the tarp. That thing runs? She asked. Sometimes. That doesn't sound confident. It's a boat. Confidence is how it tricks you. A few weeks later, I took her out anyway. The water was flat that morning, bright under the sun. Paige sat near the front with her sandals off, one hand holding her hat when the wind picked up. I had packed sandwiches, bottled water, and exactly nothing romantic. At one point, she looked back at me and said, "Did you plan this?" I planned not to sink. She laughed so hard, she had to lean forward. That was the first time I stopped worrying about whether I was doing enough. Paige didn't need a big show. She noticed smaller things. That I saved the better half of my sandwich for her without thinking. That I checked the fuel line twice. That I always reached with my left hand first when I needed a tool. By the end of summer, her apartment had changed. There were books of mine on her shelf, a clean shirt in one of her drawers, a spare pair of work boots by the door. At my house, there were flowers in an old jar on the kitchen counter, and a stack of postcards leaning against the wall where she said they would look better once I learned how to hang things straight. She was right. They did. One evening, months after Brooke came to Charleston, I was at Paige's apartment fixing the same small table we had carried in on moving day. It had started wobbling again. Paige stood beside me while I checked the loose leg. "You'd think this thing would have learned by now," I said. "It has character. It has a bad joint." She opened the kitchen drawer and held out a screwdriver. Without thinking, I reached for it with my left hand. Paige smiled. "You still do that?" I looked up at her. "What?" "Reach with your left hand first. Every time." For a second, I just stood there with the screwdriver in my hand. Then I said, "You still notice." Her smile got quieter. She reached into her bag and took out the worn leather keychain, the one with my initials. She held it out to me. I didn't ask if she was sure. I already knew she was. I took it from her, clipped it to my keys, and tightened the table leg until it stopped moving. Then I stood up, looked at Paige in the warm light from the balcony door, and knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be.